So anyway, hi, I'm Sarah.
And I am Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode. Introduction: who are we and what are we doing?
Sarah, what movie are we talking about this week?
This week we will be talking about All the Way. And Rena, can you give us the trigger warning?
This movie contains depictions of racism, repeated use of a certain six-letter antebellum ethnic slur starting with the letter N and its equally offensive derivatives, profanity, political violence, hate crimes, misogyny, and homophobia. Sarah, is there anything that you can think of that I may have left out?
This is quite the laundry list of magic you've got here, so no, nothing to add. Cool. Rena, can you give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning, we are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points in works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie. Consider yourself warned.
The sources used in this episode include volumes 1, 2, and 4 of Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson bio.
I also watched a documentary on Hubert Humphrey, which confirmed that Bradley Whitford did a good job, because I realized that while many of the people in this are sort of embedded in my psyche via reactions that my parents' generation had to them, I realized I had no mental Hubert Humphrey, and I needed to get one so that I could judge.
He's one that, like, I cannot place in my head at any given time. And Bradley Whitford did a good job giving me something to place in my mind going forward. I always kind of picture him as sort of like an eager beaver striver, which he very much was.
We are recording this on the evening of October 29th, 2024. As part of our Presidential Month series, we do not know the outcome of the 2024 American presidential election.
Before I get into my litany of observations, Rena, do you want to give us a rundown just about LBJ?
Lyndon Johnson, our 36th president, was born in 1908 in Stonewall, Texas, and died in 1973 in Johnson City, Texas. His father was a member of the Texas legislature, and it was a rather traumatizing thing for him as a boy that when he was quite young, his father was actually a big deal, and then his father failed as a farmer, and the family was quite poorly off, and this makes a major character change in him. He goes to a small college within Texas. Eventually, he runs for Congress. He serves some terms in the House. He goes on to the Senate. He becomes JFK's vice president, and then he becomes president when, spoiler, JFK is shot on November 22nd, 1963. LBJ is someone that people have conflicting feelings about. He wanted to eradicate poverty. He launched a series of programs called the Great Society, but he was undermined by the Vietnam War. And he's also someone that I have strong feelings about. I have been working my way through Robert Caro's biography for the past 20 years, but Robert Caro has been writing his multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson since before you and I were born.
I mean, Homeboy loves thoroughness.
It's peculiar. There are 20th century presidents who I admire much, much more, like the Roosevelts, but Johnson is sort of my favorite because he's such a bizarre character study. Reading Caro, I found myself just laughing my head off at the multiplying depths of his scumbaggery. And yet, when it came time to cash out his chips, this man who, if you listen to him talk, did not sound all that different than other Southern white men of his generation most of the time, he cashed his chips out for civil rights, but modern shitty politicians cash their chips out to get tax cuts for the wealthy. And what is fascinating to me is the miracle of Lyndon Johnson, is that he cashed his chips for civil rights and to help poor people when his character was so terrible. What flipped that switch? And I guess also his story, and then the story of how the Great Society that he wasn't able to finish was subsequently eroded, is to me a testament on the American left's eternal propensity for shooting itself in the foot. But just to talk about what a terrible person Lyndon Johnson was from fairly early and why. So from volume 1 of Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson, this is about what it was like to attend college with Lyndon Johnson. Just to begin with, he was a liar, Mr. Caro writes. To some of his fellow students, in fact, it seemed unwise to believe Lyndon Johnson on any subject. In their opinion, he seemed almost unable to tell the unvarnished truth about even the most innocuous subject. And he goes on to write about Lyndon Johnson. He had made a great point of describing himself as a tough man in a fist fight, something believable, despite his awkwardness because of his size. During a poker game, however, he began arguing with another student and wouldn't stop shouting at him. The other boy jumped up and lunged at him. Johnson, without a single gesture of resistance, immediately fell back on a bed and, as his foe approached, began kicking his feet in the air with a frantic windmilling motion. The other poker players all remember him lying there and kicking, quote, like a girl, Horace Richards says, and they remember him shouting, "If you hit me, I'll kick you. If you hit me, I'll kick you." The other men were astonished, says Whiteside, one of those present. He was a coward. You know, every kid in the state of Texas had fights then, but he wouldn't fight. He was an absolute physical coward. And the thing about it was that he had made such a big deal about what a great fighter he was.
I mean, where to begin on this beautiful tapestry? The fact that Caro included that in his book to that degree of detail is amazing, and that's why there's 100 volumes of it. Second, there's something very pragmatic about him, and the kicking is, albeit not the best or most upstanding move, but it is very practical. It does show kind of like the character of this guy is he's a scrappy ass survivor, and I don't know. I found this to be just such an interesting study in contrasts where he weaves back and forth between thinking about the big picture, but also being pragmatic. He is also doing the right thing. Sometimes it seems like he was doing the right thing for very cynical reasons, but does it even matter what motivates you if you do the right thing?
So another thing, Lyndon Johnson lied plentifully and assertively about his World War II service record. This is from Volume 2, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, Means of Ascent. Lyndon Johnson signed up for the Army, but he only actually served in active duty for one day on a flight as an observer. And the plane was fired upon by the Japanese. And I guess because the plane had been fired on, he received a Silver Star. And his initial reaction to receiving this Silver Star was that he didn't really deserve it for one day, but he soon discovered that he could make hay out of, oh, I have a Silver Star for military service. Leading up to this, Caro writes, for 5 months he delayed and stalled, made no serious attempt to get into combat while having what his sidekick, John Connolly, was to call a lot of fun. And when after 6 months had passed, he finally did enter a combat zone, when he no longer had any choice, when for the sake of his political future he had to get into a combat zone and get there fast, he went not to fight, but to observe. Despite flying more than 20,000 miles to reach that combat zone and return home, the only brush he had with the war was to fly as an observer on a single mission, at the conclusion of which he left the combat zone on the next plane out. Over time, he began to embroider this, again, Robert Caro. The mission he had flown became missions. The 20,000 miles he had flown became 50,000 miles, then 60,000. The time he had spent in combat was made to appear longer and longer. I'm just truncating this. His actual role as an observer, not an airman, an observer who had flown a single mission, an observer who had not had months of active duty, and who had never been paid busy visits every day for a time, all but vanished from the telling. He portrayed himself as a war-scarred veteran of many battles on many fronts. By 1944, he was stating, "I lived with the men on fighting fronts. I flew with them on missions over enemy territory. I ate and slept with them." He began saying that because he had been too tall to fit into the parachute provided, he had flown without one. And then he added another fillip. Only one parachute had been available, and he had given it to a friend. The engine that had malfunctioned on his plane now, in his accounts, had been knocked out by Japanese Zeros. Several of his crew had been wounded. In reality, his squadron had shot down a single Zero. In his retelling, the number steadily rose. "I saw 14 of them go down in flames right in front of me." Robert Caro also notes that Johnson over time may have even come to believe his own lying because he had this Silver Star, which he, Caro notes, instead, not only did Johnson accept the Silver Star, he arranged to accept it in public several times. After purchasing the decoration in an Army-Navy store in Washington, he took it to Texas, where in a number of public appearances, it was affixed to his lapel as if for the first time. In Fort Worth, for example, the commander of the local American Legion post pinned it on him while a crowd of legionnaires cheered. And Johnson stood before them, head bowed, face somber, hardly able to blink back tears. And once he had it, he flaunted it. A medal for Lyndon Johnson was not a medal that was hidden away in a drawer. Lyndon Johnson rapidly came to feel not only that he deserved it, but that he deserved more. That the Silver Star was not a sufficiently high honor for such heroism as his. I thought that this was also, like that thing about threatening to kick people while flailing about on the bed, likewise quite illustrative of just what a total piece of work.
Yeah.
What a lying coward.
The energy that he had was, to me, very George W. Bushy. I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but like the part where he takes Humphrey on the car that turns into a boat, I was like, this is something that would happen if you went to visit George W. Bush on his ranch. He would 100% trick you into thinking that you were going to drown in his car and have it turn into a boat.
I was like, are these even a thing? But then at the end, they show like pictures of him driving the real version of that on the ranch.
Should I talk about the movie? So, All the Way, the movie, it's a 2016 television film based on events during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson, specifically the first year that he was in office. It was directed by Jay Roach and adapted by Robert Schenken from his 2012 play, All the Way, which I did see on Broadway. The film stars Bryan Cranston, who is reprising his role as Johnson from the Broadway production, opposite Melissa Leo as First Lady Lady Bird Johnson, Anthony Mackie as Martin Luther King Jr., and Frank Langella as Senator Richard Russell Jr. The film was broadcast on HBO on Saturday, May 21st, 2016. It received positive reviews, lots of praise for Cranston. It was nominated for a slew of awards, won very few. It was nominated for 8 Primetime Emmy Awards, including an acting nomination for Bryan Cranston. Just for trivia's sake, the Emmy that year was won by Courtney B. Vance, who was playing Johnny Cochran in American Crime Story, The People versus O.J. Simpson, which was a well-deserved, well-earned award by Courtney B. Vance. Don't want to get into contests over that stuff. All the Way drew 1.1 million total viewers, and it was the second most watched at the time it aired HBO original movie behind previous episode Bessie. This is one of our many journeys into the world of Martin Luther King that we've made on this show without being a movie that is specifically about Dr. King. So Jay Roach is also known as Mr. Susanna Hoffs from the Bangles. That is why I know him best, but he started out with the Austin Powers movies and made Game Change, the one about Sarah Palin. He made whatever the heck the Fox News one was with Bombshell. So he's touched a lot of like recent politics and politicky stuff, and he also directed upcoming film Trumbo. So good stuff. And if there's one thing that I find incredibly traumatizing to watch in movies, it's events of extreme cruelty from the civil rights movement. And this movie depicts one of the most notorious crimes committed during the civil rights movement, which is during the Freedom Summer, where they were registering people to vote. Northern kids went down to the South to register people to vote in Mississippi. 3 young men were murdered by rednecks. Get it together, white people. And they show that in this movie. It was a really critical part of getting some of the civil rights acts that LBJ got passed, getting those passed. How old were you when you saw Eyes on the Prize?
12 or so, I think.
I was, 12 also, and I carry with me forever and ever the image of Emmett Till. I think that was the first dead body I ever saw, was Emmett Till's picture in Eyes on the Prize. Like, wait, I'm also like a privileged white lady. I get that too. But I would say that it's incredibly terrible to watch these events in movies just because of the profound, indifferent cruelty. And we're in a time now where we're seeing a lot of that too, where there's like this enthusiasm for being incredibly cruel to people. And so I was kind of dreading watching this. And also, we just finished Lincoln a week ago, and that ended in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment. And this movie starts in 1963. Like, what the hell were we doing for 100 years? And that is very much a rhetorical question. We see it in the casual indifference of the leadership about what is going on here. And, and just this sort of idea that we need to slow down. And it's like, you've had 100 years of redlining and Jim Crow. Like, you can't slow it down much more without like finding a way to go even farther backwards. But anyway, back to the movie. So we open on the assassination of JFK, where they are finding out that he is dead.
In the later portions of Volume 4 of Robert Caro, the part describing what happened to LBJ in the motorcade is incredibly gripping. They really got a lot of things down, like that he's standing in a little room where the path to it is kind of windy, and there are those curtain separators around him that hospitals use to try to give patients a false sense of privacy.
One of the things I hated from the moment that it started, when we first see Cranston, is the ears. I got used to it, but having seen him on Broadway, he had the physicality. It wasn't as much bells and whistles prosthetic wise. So I was a little bit turned by the ears. Because he is such a good actor throughout the movie, it starts to become less distracting as he brings you in.
I actually thought they did a great job making him look like Lyndon Johnson. I was not distracted by the ears. I thought they did everything that they could to be convincing, and that it was a testimony to how much better prosthetics and aging makeup have become in the past 30 years when we compare this against something like Gandhi or other stuff. I guess my one note, like, it only occurred to me just now about that they don't really make much of an effort on Anthony Mackie, is that sometimes Bradley Whitford gets a little bit pancakey, but he's playing someone who he looks nothing like. And also, Melissa Leo was unrecognizable in this.
Yeah, I had to keep reminding myself that was Melissa Leo. When this was a Broadway play, this was a role that was combined with a few other roles. It was one actor playing several different women, including Ladybirds. I don't know how good their real marriage was, but I really like their dynamic in this.
So, IRL, he cheated on her a lot. He cheated on her with the mistress of a prominent funder of his. She was a shy, dumpy rich man's daughter. He needed to marry money. Another mistress of his was Helen Gahagan Douglas, the grandmother of Ileana Douglas, who she was she was a congresswoman. She was married to Melvin Douglas, who played the Thin Man, and she unsuccessfully ran for Senate in California against Richard Nixon.
Ugh, it all comes back to that monster. Not to compare this to Reagan, because who wants to talk about Reagan anymore? You do see also like how acting can be so good sometimes and writing can be so good sometimes that you stop seeing like the prosthetics and you see the actor. And that's a thing that happened in this that maybe didn't happen in Reagan.
Again, I thought the prosthetics were very convincing.
Oh, they were convincing. I just noted and I just noticed them, and maybe it's because I have spent a lot of time gazing at the visage of Bryan Cranston. I was like, oh, those are ears. It fell away though, as I said, like because the acting was so good and he was so good.
For me, if they did not put ears on him, state-of-the-art 21st century ears, not Party City ears, but ears, I would have been distracted by he doesn't look like Lyndon Johnson, because you're the film person and I'm the history person.
Yes.
And makeup has gotten a lot better.
Oh, it 100% has, and and credit to them for like once the initial distraction was gone, I wasn't tuned into it.
Well, my favorite Lyndon Johnson anecdote, aside from threatening to kick other students if they hit him and being a big liar about his military service, and I have no idea if this is apocryphal, one day Johnson was standing beside an aide and he looked at a picture of Kennedy and said, "Why can't they love me as they loved him?" And the aide said, "Because, sir, you're not lovable."
We see that on full display in this movie. He's not lovable. He is irascible, and there's a lot like of contradiction stuffed into a bag.
It's true. He did go to the bathroom with the door open in front of aides and associates to make them uncomfortable and to assert power.
Which it's a heck of a way to do that.
That is marking territory.
Yeah, it's animal. I love also that, not unlike last week, he opens up with telling Ladybird about a dream. And once again, other people's dreams are so damn boring. He's going into like what it felt like in the dream. I don't care.
We're still on the flight from Dallas back to DC.
Let's keep it moving. So he addresses Congress and he says, we are going to honor JFK's dream by getting the Civil Rights Act passed, which a whole bunch of people are not happy about. We see a bunch of white men hubbubbing and being dicks about it. And we kind of see right away, too, like as we see him getting fitted for a suit in the Oval Office, that contrast of that cynic and that person who realizes like opportunity and the political games that he can play while also, just happening to be doing the right thing and seeing the value of what he's doing. It's interesting because he is cynical, but also he realizes that this is the right thing to do.
And again, that is the mystery and miracle of Lyndon Johnson, that he put his chips behind that. Things that I noted about racist Southern senators, who we'll see a number of real racist Southern senators portrayed here, and also about wardrobe. One of the things I appreciated was that they showed how men in that generation wore their waistbands much higher than we do now. That silhouette is so unsexy to us now, but they did show like the flood pant things. But also another thing, James Eastland, if that name rings a distant bell, that is the senator that Joe Biden mentioned. And I guess he was trying to highlight his ability to get along with people who had very different views from him on issues, where Joe Biden said, "He didn't call me boy, he called me son," and we all groaned inwardly. Eastland took me on a bit of a rabbit hole because I thought, well, yes, Joe Biden, James Eastland called you son, but I wonder, given his record, what did he call his Senate colleagues? Margaret Chase Smith, the senator from Maine, or Daniel Inouye, the senator from Hawaii, or Edward Brooke, the first Black senator since Reconstruction. And I went and I found Edward Brooke's autobiography to see, well, what did he recount about this very racist senator who was so lovely to the young Joe Biden? I was not able to find anything, but I found a very interesting anecdote about Strom Thurmond, who is also a character in this. It was 1967 when racists were throwing chemicals into swimming pools, so very keen to go desegregate the Senate swimming pool. He arrived at the Senate swimming pool where he saw Strom Thurmond and two other racist Dixiecrats who, now that he was their colleague, they were quite welcoming. Like, "Come on in, Ed. The water's great." And we now know that Strom Thurmond had no problem with taking his clothes off in front of Black people.
Didn't he share his sperm with some Black people, though?
Yes, that is what I was alluding to when I said that he had no problem taking his clothes off in front of Black people.
Oh, well, yes. And no problem sharing.
Sperm, at any rate.
What a piece of work.
I like that story.
I hate all these people. I hate all of them. Every time they cut to one, and then they cut to Frank Langella, who is like a super conflicted character in this. All of these white guys are just like, no. And they have to watch how they talk because they're afraid they're going to be perceived as redneck goons, which I'm like, yeah, that's what you are. We start to see LBJ on fire, and LBJ on fire is a lot more interesting than LBJ being quiet. And we also meet J. Edgar Hoover, is played by Stephen Root. He gets the creepiness down of J. Edgar right away. He was just a monster who had too much power for too long, but he also has a very sort of creepy mien. And I think that this movie, one of the things I couldn't help but kind of be contrasting it in my mind to the play. And there's things that you can do on film that you obviously cannot do on stage. And the way that they were able to weave in how much of a threat J. Edgar Hoover was to everyone he dealt with was really elegantly done in terms of the way they'd cut to showing people recording calls and people, bugging phones and things like that, which was his whole jam.
Don't know that we've yet had a warts and all portrayal of MLK around his infidelities.
No, and that shit's really complicated. I don't know what the right way to portray it is. I know in this movie it has a very significant role in his character, just because J. Edgar is going to use it against him. But also, I don't know enough about Martin Luther King's personal life to say whether or not this is fair. I think that this movie also shows like a really different Martin Luther King than we've seen in some things too, because we see him conflicted. We see him threatened by the youth movement. We see him trying to sort of like figure out where to sit in that, because there is a more radical side of the revolution kind of that he is dealing with. We know that there's a conflict between the way that MLK viewed things and the way that Malcolm X viewed things, and how to handle those things. And we have Stokely Carmichael in this movie, who was more influenced by the need to be radical and to be loud. It's an interesting look at MLK for a movie that is not about him.
I thought he was a quiet MLK. He was a conversational MLK. We don't see him imitating the big speeches.
No, we only see a speech at a funeral
where he gets interrupted. So we see him speaking without those intonations that we think of. Also, like the way that they shot that scene where J. Edgar Hoover makes the recording, where you realize he's saying goodbye to all of these people, and the last person in the room who you don't see is the woman that he's about to cheat on Coretta with.
Yeah, it's really, really well done. And LBJ is pragmatic in terms of, like, he realizes there's a lot of people's interests he needs to balance in terms of getting like the Great Society bills passed, which he proposes to Martin Luther King, like this war on poverty. And we see him trying to deal with the fact that he has a very close relationship with Frank Langella, who is a racist. And also trying to negotiate with like that idealistic, like kind of like that sort of like stereotypical liberal that Hubert Humphrey embodies.
Like
all going on, and MLK meets with SNCC, and they decide that they're going to hatch this Freedom Summer plan. Freedom Summer was in a lot of ways a disaster because of like the incredible violence that took place. Like churches were bombed. Obviously, we had 3 young men who were murdered. And they ultimately registered like 1,200 voters.
They cite that because the people they were trying to register were so scared.
It's a mess. Concurrent to all of this, they are going to try and move on this bill. And Russell announces that they will be filibustering it. And this is, you love an old-fashioned filibuster where people
I do. I love the talking filibuster. And I felt like this was being, I believe the phrase is hoist by your own petard, when last week I talked about how the talking filibuster forced people to listen to each other. And now we see a talking filibuster where people are like snoozing at their desks. So that did temper it for me somewhat. I noticed way off in a corner it showed one female congressperson. There were, I believe, 1 or 2 female senators at this time and maybe a dozen or so women in the House, but they were there, and I was a little annoyed. Could you not put one there when he's talking to Congress? It wasn't like, I mean, be proportional, but they were there. Maybe this time that I'm nostalgic for of the talking for filibuster forcing people to hear other people's arguments was more of a case of weary, barely there osmosis. But even with that, Congress still passed more bills.
I think that there's something about the talking filibuster, which there is a human toll that is taken on that, rather than just like being like, we don't want to deal with this bill and pushing it to the side. You have to do the work if you're gonna not support a bill.
That speech defending the right of racist podiatrists to turn away Black customers.
I was obsessed with how specific that anecdote was. Like, there's a podiatrist and he works in a hotel, and the hotel is this, and I'm just like, okay, this one instance that's not at all specific to you, someone you know, sir, go on. Johnson wheels and deals, he gets it passed. And Russell's kind of like, yeah, good job, but you got some problems now. And he yells at Hubert after Russell leaves, we just lost the South for a generation, my lifetime, and maybe yours. And truly, they did. They've still kind of lost huge chunks of the South.
He did not say that to Hubert Humphrey. Having lost the South for Hubert Humphrey's lifetime on top of Lyndon Johnson's would have been bad enough. He said it to the much, much younger Bill Moyers. And in an article from The Guardian, Bill Moyers, who is now 90 years old, to get to the source of it, The Guardian reached out to Bill Moyers, and Bill Moyers reports himself having said, "I said, 'Quite a day, Mr. President.' As he reached a sheaf of the wire copy, he tilted his head slightly back and held the copy up close to him so that he could read it and said, 'Well, I think we may have lost the South for your lifetime and mine.' It was lightly said, not sarcastic, not even dramatically. It was like a throwaway sidebar. To Moyers, all these years later, Johnson's remark seems maybe a jest, lightly uttered and soon forgotten. But after Moyers repeated it publicly just once, it took on a life of its own. Unfortunately, various versions appeared, for a generation, once and for all. I couldn't keep up. I finally stopped commenting. And so a legend grew. The South is still, with some vanishing exceptions, lost. And Bill Moyers is now 90.
So we get this bill passed, but also we have now the scene in which these three young men are murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and it's even they put it together pretty tastefully, but it's still agonizing. LBJ calls the governor of Mississippi, who's totally awesome and concerned about these three young men who are missing. JK, he's a monster and he's racist just like the rest of them.
LBJ kind of does the carnival short con thing with which cup is the ball under, in how he passes it between this governor and J. Edgar Hoover, and making J. Edgar worried about the CIA hopping in.
One of the ways that they were able to root out where these bodies were was there was a member of the mafia who was sent down there to engage in some extra legal tactics to get confessions as to where the bodies were. The FBI has never acknowledged whether or not this is true.
I love this story a lot, Sarah. If you can recommend whatever sources you have it from in the show notes, or
Yes.
in the other things you should watch or read segment at the end, I would be quite happy to offer that to our listeners.
I had thought that it was portrayed in Mississippi Burning, but I went back to look at the notes of that, and it does not seem to be the case. I'm not eager to watch that movie again. Nevertheless, and then like this is all happening, and LBJ is trying to run for election because he has not been elected to the role of president yet. And we hear about Strom Thurmond. Hero is going to change parties because he's got to be racist. Barry Goldwater, who is a maniac, is also running for the Republicans, and all of these monsters who are Dixiecrats who just really need to be racist more than anything else are bailing out on the party and supporting Goldwater. And then Bob McNamara comes in and is like, the Gulf of Tonkin is happening.
Paul Simon wrote a song called How I Was Robert McNamara into Submission.
He was a tactician and he was a monster, and he was the reason a lot of people died and shouldn't have. And once upon a time, the Washington Post had some balls and published papers that helped get us out of that war and prove what McNamara had been up to. Those were the days.
Another racist senator that we see here is Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who did stay in the Democratic Party until well into this century. And he makes a cameo appearance in The Audacity of Hope, where he tells Barack Obama that he regrets his membership in a certain club.
Cool. We had Klan members serving in Congress in the 21st century. Amazing. Real happy. LBJ is, every president's flawed, but I feel like him and Nixon were two of like the messiest bitches to have this job. Messes of id and of insecurity and like untreated trauma and anger and all this stuff. And they were back to back and both so extreme in the ways that they went about coping with that. And I want to give a shout out here too to an actor in this, Todd Weeks, who plays Walter Jenkins, who is LBJ's chief of staff. There's a lot of very raucous performances in this film, and he is very quiet and he is wonderful in this. Like the performance that I kept looking at during this, because he was so contained, it was understated and filled with a kind of pain that comes up towards the end of this movie. So everyone is really fired up because they find the bodies of these three young men, and the convention's starting, and there is a Black Democratic caucus that wants representation on the floor of the convention and wants votes.
I was going to say that what happens with Walter Jenkins, where he is caught in having solicited a homosexual act with another man in the restroom, leads to one of Stephen Root's best scenes, where LBJ is sounding out J. Edgar Hoover, who we now know liked to wear women's clothes and had a very close relationship with Clyde Tolson. How can you tell if someone is a homosexual? And I felt like you could almost see J. Edgar trembling and saying these things that were not true at all of Jenkins. And it's sort of like they're having a blink first contest. Is LBJ implying? Is he not? Who knows what? But I felt like you could almost see Hoover tremble.
I thought this was such a great moment for both of them, because like the line of questioning that LBJ was doing, I couldn't tell if LBJ knew what Hoover was up to. And I think that was kind of the whole point, because Hoover was responding in a way where he was being so cagey. Their acting, to me, betrayed a game of chicken.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like Stephen Root was not sure if LBJ was onto him. There was like such a tension there where I wasn't sure coming away from it if LBJ was onto him or if that was what they meant to imply. But certainly, like, J. Edgar clearly was for a moment scared of his own shadow.
There's so many ways that you could read this. That because nobody should trust J. Edgar Hoover.
No.
I'm sure LBJ doesn't trust him. If Hoover was trying to undermine him, and is he telling him, I'm on to you too? But there's so many layers of how to read this.
Meanwhile, the convention is going on and there's protesting happening. And we see a scene where an activist, Fannie Lou Hamer, speaking at the convention about her experiences in the civil rights movement in the South. And it's horrifying. Mm-hmm. And the actress who is playing this role looks so much like the real Fannie Lou.
Yes.
And it's a really great moment and a great little performance happening in here. And this is where we see like Johnson the cynic and Johnson the terrified person who's very self-interested and worried about like losing the opportunity to become president again. And he has them cut away to give a nonsense statement in the Rose Garden about how he will soon select a vice president
Yeah, and he says, I have no idea what I'm about to talk about.
It's wild, these moments where you see the fear overtake him, and also like as he's trying to like make concessions for this black caucus, and trying to also like keep these states happy that are like, if you make me vote alongside a black person, I am going to switch parties because that's how racist I am. So we're seeing a lot of like that kind of like brokering going on. And they finally do get to a resolution, and there's states that are threatening to walk out that do. And then there's states that are threatening to walk out that don't, because Johnson also says at certain points, he's like, that's enough. You're going to be there or not. Stop threatening me. But anyway, he clinches the nom, and now he has to go up against Goldwater. And as I said, Goldwater is an absolutely insane person.
They try to create some suspense around this. In reality, we have not seen an electoral landslide of this nature since 1984. He sees suspense in it, and at one point they play that ultimate Goldwater quote, the one about extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and before that, what there's something he says about moderation before that, and the thing that's fascinating to me about that quote is it is such a horseshoe theory confirming quote, because I feel like an extremist from the other end of the spectrum could also say that out of context.
For sure. And here's the building blocks that explain why the hell we're where we are right now.
Filthy LBJ got so much done. There's so much to be learned from just separate his ability to get things done on the domestic agenda from the war.
Yeah, and it's hugely tragic. And I will also say that like Nixon is hugely tragic.
Well, Nixon at least had the decency to step down when threatened with impeachment.
Yeah, there was a time when people felt shame. But anyway, yes, he does win handily. However, there's Pyrrhic victory energy to it, because immediately at his victory party, McNamara is there being like, hey, guess what? We have more problems. And is given kind of carte blanche to do what he needs to do, and Johnson will do what he needs to do in order to like keep this threat at bay. Also, there's a moment that I hated here at the end where LBJ turns and faces the camera and looks at us and breaks the fourth wall and says, I'm president. And I was like, really? Must we?
Was this something that happened in the play?
I don't remember if he talked to the audience like that. I would imagine that he probably did at some point address the audience, but it feels a lot more natural in a play setting than it does in a movie. And also in a movie that like had no moments like that beforehand.
It didn't annoy me. I wasn't disconcerted by it. I can see how someone would be, but I wasn't.
It took me out of it for a moment where I was like, okay, wink at the camera. It ends with him giving a speech about being thrilled to have won, and on to the next. And we see that Martin Luther King is going to work with him on crafting what will become the Voting Rights Act. They get that passed in 1965. It's a monumental and important piece of legislation, but progress is not a straight path. And we see that LBJ, declined to run again in 68 because he was exhausted.
He knew that he was going to lose because of the war. And again, we would have been so much better off if purists had just been willing to stuff it.
1968 was a mess of a year. I think like the campaign for president that year is a really interesting one, and unfortunately like something that we have an analog of in our present time. But I have no beef with this movie. So
I liked that it was light on foreshadowing.
Yes. I felt like it kept me in place. without being too clever, but also, very much like very purposeful in how it emphasized, like that history rhymes with itself all the time. It's not repetitive, but it's constantly rhyming, and we're constantly looking to the past to explain what is going to happen to us tomorrow. Should we get into our ratings since we've been talking for a minute?
Yes, well, but first, for choice dialogue, did you have anything? I wrote down, this ain't about principles, it's about votes. But while I love this script, it's not juicy quotable the way Lincoln is. It's more that the moments between people feel natural while also feeling like something the person would have said, with like a mild political pithiness, but not a quotable political pithiness.
I also like, I didn't have any like specific quotes that grabbed at me.
There were scenes that were memorable for themselves where the writing was very good, but basically what we're saying is that the screenwriter wasn't Tony Kushner.
Not everyone gets to be Tony Kushner, but it's fine. I think like it does a nice job of like integrating public things that he said into his private life in a very neat way. I think that he does a good job of weaving the history together with what made LBJ the person that he was to the best of his ability. Should I give our listeners a quick refresher about how we score movies?
Sure. Give our listeners that refresher.
Cool. We rate movies on a 1 to 10 scale across 10 areas that we find to be subjectively and or objectively important to most films, but specially tailored to specific issues, particular to biopics. If you want more details on how we score movies, please scroll down our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com. You'll also find a record of our scores for past episodes.
I would highly recommend listening to our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?, where we give a rundown of the methodology, why it matters to us, and some of the inspirations behind this podcast.
And with that out of the way, let's score this thing.
So for outward appearances, I gave it an 8.5. Everybody looked like who they were supposed to be. Bradley Whitford was basically unrecognizable. Lots of people were unrecognizable. I guess I dinged it slightly, not for the ears, which I thought were entirely realistic, very convincing, and necessary to me feeling that I was seeing Lyndon Johnson, more because the pancake on Bradley Whitford did get a little obvious at points, and also Anthony Mackie not really looking that much like MLK, even though there are arguments for using a light hand there.
I gave it a 6. Same reasons as you, but I dinged it harder for those reasons. Acting and casting. I gave it a 9.
I gave it a 9.5.
Yeah. They did a fine job putting this cast together. Passage of time. I gave it an 8.
I also gave it an 8 for passage of time. Costuming, I gave it a 9.
I gave it an 8.
Quality of the script, I gave it an 8.
Same.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. And we just talked about why that is, so no need to keep repeating ourselves. Accuracy, I gave it a 6.5.
I gave it a 6.
Wow. Storytelling, I gave it a 7. It did an effective and workmanlike job. It wasn't Lincoln.
Yeah, I gave it a 7 also, and yeah, like it was fine.
For production value, I gave it a 7.5. It looked good. It hit all the right spots. It didn't do anything that really knocked my socks off of, but I appreciated the little touches that they got right, like that battered bouquet sitting in the back seat of the car in Dallas, Noel womb chair that he gets up out of to move on to the bathroom so that he can make Hubert Humphrey uncomfortable. Production, direction, decision making, I gave it an 8.
Same production value rating, and I gave it an 8 for production value, and production, direction, decision making, I gave it a 7.
For Do We Care, I gave it an 8. I cared quite a bit.
Same. I gave it a 6.
My average came to 8 on the nose. What's yours?
Mine came to 7.3.
And with that, I'm so sorry all the way. You did not earn second opinion.
That's too bad. I bet we would have gotten to read a lot of fun stuff from racists.
All the way, your score comes to 7.65.
A fine film.
Yes, indeed. Perfectly worth an evening.
Indeed. Are there any things that you would like to recommend?
Even after 30 plus years that it's been around, Eyes on the Prize is still well worth watching. Also, Robert Caro on Lyndon Johnson is a great read. The part describing how LBJ experienced Dallas, where he couldn't tell what the heck was going on, is a pretty thrilling read. And it's full of fun stories about what a scumbag LBJ was and how he got that way.
Indeed. I would like to recommend Mafia's Son, The Scarpa Mob Family, the FBI, and a Story of Betrayal. And I am recommending that because Gregory Scarpa was the mobster that the FBI would bring down to the South to solve the murder case of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. And he would also do that again for them later on, and find the killer of a man named Vernon Dahmer, who was a civil rights leader who was murdered in Mississippi.
I had a recommendation as an addendum to last week's episode, Lincoln, that I forgot about at the time. In the second Obama administration, back when we had a president who could quite happily hold his own at the White House press correspondence dinner, aka Nerd Prom. The premise of this sketch that Obama filmed for it was that Steven Spielberg has directed Daniel Day-Lewis playing Obama, and it has the typography of Lincoln. There's that fear that it's going to be DDL. But actually, Obama comes out and starts saying, yeah, I'm Daniel Day-Lewis. I thought, why not play Obama?
Oh, I love that. That's delightful. Is there like a specific feeling that we get when we fear that we're about to see blackface?
There's probably a great Latin descriptor for that.
There's probably a German word for it. Germans have a lot of interesting words.
It would be It would be Schwarze word for makeup, fear, and premonition, but in German.
Yes, that sounds delightful. I would also, this is kind of a random recommendation, but I tend to listen to it around presidential elections, Stephen Sondheim's Assassins. I get a ton of comfort from it during times of great uncertainty. I think that's always good historical context and learning opportunities, and there is a sequence of events at the end where you get to the assassination of JFK. And I always find that when I listen to it, I am anew experiencing like the fear, like, please don't do it every time. When you see the hole it ripped in the world in that decade, and this is part of that fallout. It's really heartbreaking, but also, as I said, like, it's comforting. Time moves on. I guess that's our show. So, let me give the outro. If you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is Biopic, a podcast story. So do check us out there, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Please also check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see the official episode ratings for all the movies that we've done so far. And if you would like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Amistad.
Amistad!